About 10 years ago, I was visiting a friend of mine in Vermont. We were eating lunch, and he offered me some raw milk. He said it's really good. I'm not really a milk drinker, not since I was a kid. Maybe chocolate milk. And to be honest, my gut reaction was, isn't that teeming with harmful germs and stuff? But hang on, milk is not inherently contaminated. It depends on whether the cow was infected and also the people handling it. But it could be contaminated. There's always a risk. But I'd taken risks with medium rare hamburgers before. What am I, a hypocrite? But if I did get sick, the consequences could be very serious. But I didn't want to seem all closed-minded and negative and stuff. So I tasted a little bit. It tasted like milk, which I don't really drink. I realized I'm not really the person to ask about any differences in flavor. So I said, it's okay, but I don't want any more. He said, okay. And we went on eating our lunch. Then after lunch, he got out this pamphlet with a peaceful drawing of a cow on it. A campaign for real milk. Hey, you know a lot about this health stuff. What do you think about this? I thought, uh-oh. Flavor is one thing, but there are health claims being made? Now, I know that just because something runs contrary to a widely accepted public health measure doesn't mean it's wrong. But historically, health measures don't get made, much less widely accepted, without a lot of professionals, politicians, business owners, and regular people arguing about it. The status quo of today is the result of the arguments of the past. So when there are things that run counter to that result, these things tend to be one-sided. But my friend did ask me to look at it, and I didn't want to dismiss it without knowing anything about it, and it wasn't like I wasn't curious. Maybe there was something I was missing. Real feed for cows is green grass in spring, summer, and fall. It is not soy meal, cottonseed meal, or other commercial feeds. Most milk, even most milk labeled organic, comes from dairy cows that are kept in confinement their entire lives and never see green grass. Buy only milk from old-fashioned cows, such as Jerseys and Guernseys. Well, I didn't know anything about cow feed, but it sounded reasonable. And I support good quality of life for cows, sustainable farming and all that. What did they have to say about health? Homogenized milk has been linked to heart disease. What? Raw milk is very effective at preventing scurvy? What? Studies show that children fed raw milk have more resistance to TB. But that's one of the things you can get from raw milk. That's one of the reasons pasteurization became a requirement. What is this, opposite land? Is what I said out loud. Well, one thing that was good was they actually cited some sources. I don't think this is true, but I'll look at these studies and email you. And thus began a journey. I did look at the sources, and I will say, they were not what I expected. I'm Dr. Jen, PharmD. Welcome to my channel, Bogus Health Advice. I ran into this pamphlet years ago, but it seems to have taken on new relevance, with RFK Jr., who promotes raw milk, being head of HSS, and with outbreaks of bird flu among cattle. So today I'm going to talk about real milk, nature's perfect food. Real milk. Kind of adversarial. Get a real job. Get a real car. Get some real headphones. Get a real e-bike. Get a real hobby. Get some real Lazzaroni amaretto. This is real Lazzaroni amaretto. It's a criticism, an insult aimed at the standard milk we buy at the store. Real milk is full fat, unprocessed, meaning non-homogenized and unpasteurized, from pasture-fed animals. A campaign for real milk is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation. This isn't just milk, it's a campaign. They chose that font for real milk, and by golly, they're sticking to it. And let's be upfront, those things make it taste better to a lot of people. But what about health claims? Let's start with homogenization. Homogenization is the process of making something the same. It's like putting fruit in a blender, fruit being analogous to butterfat globules. Homogenized? Non-homogenized. Homogenized milk has been linked to heart disease. That doesn't make any biological sense. Hope you aren't drinking any raw milk milkshakes. Okay, but I'm not here to make an argument based on disbelief. If that's what the evidence shows, I'll need to rethink it. But they don't have the citation in the pamphlet. Okay, I searched the Real Milk website and found this article. Milk homogenization and heart disease. One widely held popular theory singles out homogenization as a cause of the current epidemic of heart disease. Well, that is one of the sentences of all time. One widely held? I have my doubts. Popular, well, that definitely makes something true. Theory, they mean hypothesis. Singles out homogenization as a cause. If it's a cause, it's not really single, is it? Of the current epidemic of heart disease. Well, there was an epidemic of heart disease in the 1960s. A few years have passed since then. Moving on. The hypothesis, I knew it. The hypothesis was developed by Kurt A. Oster, MD, and studied from the early 1960s till the mid-1980s. In studying and comparing the structure and biochemistry of healthy and diseased arterial tissue, Oster investigated plasmalogen, an essential fatty component. I don't have time for this. I want to focus on pasteurization. Let's just jump ahead to the conclusion. The fact that Oster's theory has been disproven does not mean that the homogenization process is benign. Seriously? All that just to say it's been disproven? During homogenization, there is a tremendous increase in surface area on the fat globules. This may account for the increased allergenicity of modern processed milk. They mention allergenicity for the first time in the last paragraph, without any evidence. And it also doesn't make much sense. It's a bait and switch, and it makes the pamphlet into a liar. Well, whatever. Homogenized, non-homogenized, no health risks that I know of, or can even imagine either way. I can't say the same for pasteurization. Now, something to know is that pasteurization is not some mysterious, complicated process. It's a form of cooking. You can do it in your kitchen. Cooking kills germs. That's why we do it in this case. Cooking alters chemistry, which can affect flavor, and also makes it plausible that there could be health differences. So, what do they have to say about it? Studies show that children fed raw milk have more resistance to TB than children fed pasteurized milk. The Lancet, that raw milk is very effective in preventing scurvy and protecting against flu, diphtheria, and pneumonia. The American Journal of Diseases in Children, that raw milk prevents tooth decay, even in children who eat a lot of sugar. The Lancet, that raw milk is better than pasteurized milk in promoting growth and calcium absorption. Ohio Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin 518, that a substance present in raw cream, but not in pasteurized cream, prevents joint stiffness and the pain of arthritis. Annual Review of Biochemistry. And that children who drink raw milk have fewer allergic skin problems and far less asthma than children who drink pasteurized milk. The Lancet. They have an affinity for old-fashioned things, including, apparently, old-fashioned sources. 1937, 1917, 1933, 1944. Hey, they do have that one tacked on at the end from 2001. That's practically yesterday. Let's start there. It's a study that found that children in rural areas who grew up on farms had asthma, allergies, and eczema with less frequency than children who didn't grow up in a farming environment. And guess what? Children on the farm drank farm milk, fresh and generally raw. And also they were around all kinds of different animals. And also they helped with haying. And also they spent a lot of time in sheds and barns. And also they were in regular contact with animal feed and animal waste. You get the idea. The environment includes, but is not limited to, fresh unpasteurized milk. It's an interesting study that touches on an idea called the hygiene hypothesis. The idea that when infants grow up in an environment that's too clean, they're more likely to develop autoimmune conditions like asthma or allergies. Thus, it's good for infants to be exposed to germs. As long as they're not germs that, make them sick or kill them, which can be a little difficult to control. But that topic really deserves its own video, and it deserves looking at newer studies than 2001. Let's see where the rest comes from. To do that, we have to go back in time. 1944, the Annual Review of Biochemistry, Volume 18, page 435. But wait, Volume 18 was in 1949? In 1944, Volume 13, on page 435, is the article, The Fat-Soluble Vitamins. In 1949, Volume 18, on page 435, is the article, Water-Soluble Vitamins. Which did they actually mean to refer to? Neither of these, by the way, are studies. They're overviews of the scientific understanding at the time of fat-soluble vitamins and water-soluble vitamins, respectively. Also, it took me a while to notice this, but they did one of these every year. I mean, not the Annual Review of Biochemistry in general. I already assumed they did that annually. But they had an article for water-soluble vitamins and an article for fat-soluble vitamins every year from 1936 until the early 60s. That raises the question, what was so special about the scientific understanding of vitamins in 1944 or 1949 in particular? Why not 1954? Why not 1962? At the risk of sounding undedicated, I don't want to pay $64 to find out what they knew about water-soluble vitamins in 1949 and fat-soluble vitamins in 1944, but maybe we can figure it out. The reference is for this. A substance present in raw cream, but not in pasteurized cream, prevents joint stiffness and the pain of arthritis. They're talking about cream, the fatty layer of milk. So fat-soluble vitamins. But what is this substance? Thank Google we have, Google. I found a book that references this exact same source, complete with the exact same wrong volume. It says that feeding raw cream cured wrist stiffness in guinea pigs. How do you even measure wrist stiffness in guinea pigs? I don't know, and I'm not paying $25 to find out. After more searching, I figured out they must be referring to anti-stiffness factor, or Wilson factor, as described in a chapter about the nutritional requirements of guinea pigs. I also found a webpage that lets us know that the facts about this important fat-soluble nutrient have been lost to modern science. Well, I guess that means it won't have a Wikipedia page. Stigmasterol is among the most abundant of plant sterols. Apparently, there's also some in unpasteurized cream. The cows get it from the plants in their diet. It's not exactly a great pitch for raw milk if it's easier to get by eating plants. Maybe that's why they don't tell you what the substance is. Also, this leads us to some boring health advice. Eat your vegetables. But there is something they brought up that does relate to a water-soluble vitamin. The pamphlet says, raw milk is very effective at preventing scurvy. Let's talk about scurvy. Scurvy is the disease caused by not getting enough vitamin C, or ascorbic acid. Scorbic, meaning scurvy. A, meaning absence of. Absence of scurvy. Vitamin C is used to maintain connective tissue and blood vessels. It's also important for wound healing and immune function. Without it, the tissues can no longer be repaired, and the body basically starts to fall apart. If not corrected, it's eventually fatal. The cure for scurvy is, of course, vitamin C. All animals need vitamin C, and most animals can synthesize it in their bodies. But a few species can't. This includes us, some other primates, fruit bats, capybaras, and guinea pigs. We have to get our vitamin C from our diet, and that's what makes scurvy possible. Scurvy's always been with us, and always will be. But there have been some periods of history when it's been more of a problem than others. When people hear scurvy, they often think of sailors. That's because in the late 1400s, really long sea voyages became a thing. Sailors were away from fresh food for weeks on end. And freshness is important because vitamin C breaks down with time. Methods of preservation like heating and fermenting also break it down. Oranges and lemons are famous because they have such a high vitamin C content that even when most of the vitamin C is lost, they still have enough. A lot of sailors developed scurvy and many died. So how was this solved? The mainstream narrative is that in 1747, the Scottish physician James Lind found the cure for scurvy in one of the world's first clinical trials. On HMS Salisbury, he treated 12 sailors suffering from scurvy. He gave 2 of them cider, 2 of them elixir of vitriol, 2 of them seawater, 2 of them a paste of spices and herbs, 2 of them vinegar, and 2 of them oranges and lemons. The last 2 men improved dramatically in just 6 days, which was good because that's when the oranges and lemons ran out. Lind documented this in his book, A Treatise of the Scurvy, in 1753. Oranges and lemons cured scurvy. Problem solved. Just kidding. The short version of the story stops there, but there's more. Nothing actually changed in the British Navy for more than 40 years. Lind's groundbreaking discovery was rebuffed and ignored by the bureaucrats of the Sick and Hurt Board. They were given the treatise, but took no action. Instead, the penny-pinching commissioners invested in a much cheaper but ineffective wort of malt. It wasn't until later, when Scottish physician Gilbert Blaine came along, that anyone listened. He read the treatise and was a big proponent of citrus fruit for scurvy. He was of high social standing. He had an in with the elites. He pushed the British Navy to keep records of all illnesses and showed that more men died from scurvy than from the enemy. Like, a lot more. In 1793, he persuaded Admiral Allen Gardner to petition the Sick and Hurt Board for lemons. Then Blaine himself was appointed to the Sick and Hurt Board in September 1795. Soon after, that same year in May, 1795, the Sick and Hurt Board started issuing lemons to all their ships. Problem solved. Something seems off at the end there. January, February, March, May is before September. Actually, there's something off from the start. When Lind published the treatise in 1753, he wasn't the first to write about fresh fruits and vegetables and scurvy. Just 19 years earlier, Johan Bäckström wrote in his book, Observations on Scurvy. Scurvy is solely owing to the total abstinence from fresh vegetable food and greens, which is alone the primary cause of the disease. We know now that he was spot on. Eat your vegetables. But he wasn't the first either. In 1617, over 130 years before the treatise, military surgeon John Woodall wrote in his book, The Surgeon's Mate, "The use of the juice of lemons is a precious medicine and well tried, being sound and good. Let it have the chief place, for it will deserve it." And back in 1601, Commander James Lancaster was giving his crew 3 spoonfuls every morning of lemon juice. Even in 1593, more than 150 years before the treatise, Sir Richard Hawkins gave his men oranges and lemons for scurvy, and documented it, although he didn't publish till 1622. In fact, in his treatise, Lind himself talks about how people have used citrus fruits for scurvy for nearly 200 years. Lind didn't claim it was his idea, or that it was even a new idea at all. But stories of advancements throughout history, being the work of individual heroes, are popular and compelling. These heroes sometimes, like Lind, are tragically dismissed, only to be proven right in the end. I find this kind of story is especially told by people who feel their own ideas are being dismissed. Sometimes you have heroes like Blaine, who strive to put right what once went wrong, and through determination and perseverance are triumphant in the end. Heroes, of course, play a role, but history tends to be a team effort. And now I suppose you expect to hear a different story. And I suppose I should tell you. Lind did confirm lemon juice with a controlled trial. Not one that would be up to today's standards, but the idea at the time was innovative. He documented scurvy quite extensively for the medical community, perhaps too extensively. Treatise of the scurvy was over 450 pages long. It might have helped if he had spent more than 4 pages talking about his experiment, and if he had clearly promoted citrus fruit as a solution to scurvy. But Lind believed that scurvy was caused by faulty digestion and perspiration, with contributing factors like foul air, damp atmosphere, bad water, and excessive work. Citrus might be a good remedy, but the problem was the whole environment. As eager as the penny-pinching Sick and Hurt Board were to supply lemons to all British Navy ships, I'm sure they were equally thrilled about making their ships, those things out in the middle of the water, less damp, and asking their men not to work so hard. Really, they did take the treatise seriously, but it's long, technical, and seemingly contradictory at times. They didn't know what to make of it, so they sought expert advice from outside doctors. The feedback was mixed, and with no clear medical guidance, nothing changed. Lemons would have been expensive. Lemons don't just grow on trees. I mean, they do, but only in season. Even with the money, sourcing large numbers of lemons during certain times of year would have been no easy task. Lind did describe and recommend a method of preservation, a rob that was made by slowly evaporating lemon juice at near boiling temperature. It made bulky lemons into a portable syrup that could be stored for years and still look and taste the same. Lind never tested the effectiveness of his rob. I mean, there wouldn't have been any reason for him to think it wouldn't work. But we know today that the heating would have destroyed a portion of the vitamin C, and time would slowly finish off the rest. The rob would have still been useful in high enough doses if it was relatively fresh, but the British Navy was kind of right not to invest in it. And 11 years later, a more economical and clear recommendation came from another doctor, David McBride, wort of malt. He had a compelling theory about how scurvy was a disease of putrefaction, and the cure was fixed air, or carbon dioxide. Fermented foods were the key. And outside the Navy, Captain Cook used wort of malt with stunning success. He circumnavigated the globe twice with 0 scurvy deaths. Although he pretty much used every plausible remedy, including Lind's rob, he tricked his men into eating sauerkraut, which they didn't like very much, by serving it only at the officers' table. And he went to Port often and made sure his men ate their vegetables there. It wasn't exactly a controlled trial. But for the British Navy, going to Port often wasn't always an option, like during a war. In the 1780s, it started to become clear, just from practical experience, that wort of malt was not so great. Interestingly, many modern writers have reconsidered Lind's role in history. Far fewer have reconsidered Blaine's role. I'll credit naval historian Brian Vail for giving me a different perspective. Blaine, for his part, did make a difference. Since he kept track of illnesses, he was able to make a practical argument to invest in the health of sailors. And with the support of his admiral, he made many improvements to their quality of life. He pushed to have fresh fruit and vegetables available whenever possible. Whether he had to persuade Gardner or any other admirals to petition for lemons, or whether they already believed in lemons and that's why they chose him, is an open question. The Sick and Hurt Board made its decision before Blaine joined, but he certainly fit right in once he did. By the 1790s, many people involved were in support of lemons. Blaine was, of course, but so were some other naval physicians, such as Thomas Trotter and John Harness. Several admirals were, including Alan Gardner, Sir Roger Curtis, Lord Hood, Lord Howe, Sir George Keith Elphinstone, and Lord St. Vincent. And of course, the Sick and Hurt Board commissioners at the time. 2 of them, Dr. James Johnson and Dr. Robert Blair, were ex-naval surgeons. That hadn't been the case 40 years before. And the other 2, Sir William Gibbons and Robert Lullman, should also be credited with making a commitment to lemons. And commitment was what it took. Changing policy didn't solve the practical barrier of securing massive amounts of lemons. There were a lot of ups and downs in implementation. It was a team effort. Given time, though, they were successful. Hey, what happened outside the British Navy anyway? The way the story's been told, you'd think nobody knew about lemons until Lind. And then finally in 1795, the whole world changed. Anyway, what does all this vitamin C stuff have to do with milk? They're the ones who brought it up. Okay, cow's milk has some vitamin C in it, a variable amount. Pasteurization does break some of it down, as does time. How much vitamin C? Well, in 1983, researchers Hedden and Lowenstein measured the vitamin C content of raw milk to be about 23 milligrams per liter. That means an adult would need to drink about 3 to 4 liters of raw milk to get their daily recommended vitamin C. 4 liters is about a gallon. They measured ultra-pasteurized milk at about 16 milligrams per liter, which would make it 4.5 to 5.5 liters. Okay, so if your entire diet is cow's milk, then yeah, maybe a 30% loss of vitamin C matters. Iron deficiency will be your concern at that point. There are easier ways these days to get your vitamin C. 25% of my daily recommended intake in one serving. What? It's whole grain. Fine, I'll get something more healthy. Only 10%? 1937, The Lancet. It's one of the oldest, most prestigious, and well-known peer-reviewed medical journals. It's a world-renowned source of clinical and general health knowledge. I read it for the articles. But seriously, it has articles, editorials, commentary, book reviews, correspondence, news features. This citation takes us back to 1937, to the House of Lords. That's in the UK, where controversy raged. A clause had been added to a bill that had been previously unopposed. The clause would require milk pasteurization in their area. Typhoid fever had ravaged 3 towns in Dorset County the year before. Over 700 people got sick, and 51 people died. The source was traced back to contaminated milk, raw milk. If the milk had been pasteurized, it would have killed the typhoid bacteria, and this never would have happened. At the Parliament, Lord Cranworth gave quite the lengthy statement opposing the possible legislation. Hang on. Did you think this was a study? Not, a news summary of a politician at Parliament debating over legislation? Now, assuming that Lord Cranworth cited his sources, why not just cite those sources directly? Because saying it's from the Lancet makes it sound more legit. Despite this exclusive breaking news being behind a paywall, I actually managed to find the full discussion, which I'll link in the description below. The pamphlet claims that children fed raw milk have more resistance to TB than children fed pasteurized milk, and that raw milk prevents tooth decay. This seems to be a reference to Lord Cranworth talking about Dr. Bernardo's Home, which is a rescue home for children. Dr. Bernardo's Home must, I think, be a pretty good medium for experiment. There are 8,500 children there. The head doctor, Dr. MacDonald, made an exhaustive study of this subject, and he came to certain conclusions. Okay, I looked for this exhaustive study. What I found was correspondence, in which Dr. MacDonald states his opinion. It's a published opinion in the British Medical Journal, in the letters to the editor section. Now, surely experience with 8,500 children, which was across 96 different homes, would make for a pretty informed opinion, right? Informed? Sure. Controlled? No. Documented? No. Able to point to differences in health and say it's due to a single factor? No. Anyway, he states, pasteurization per se is probably the best way of supplying cities with milk under present conditions. Then he adds, it is interesting to note. Yes. Interesting to note. Not making an argument here, just saying. It is interesting to note that the child on raw milk is very fit, that chilblains are practically eliminated, and that Dr. E. Sprawson has shown that teeth are less likely to decay owing to better dentine formation. Our experience, through a succession of years, shows that tubercle is not the result of drinking raw milk. When pressed for evidence on that last part, he described his experience with the 750 boys. The evidence on which my statement was based is that in one of our homes, containing about 750 boys, during 5 years, while they were on a daily pint of raw milk, only one case of non-pulmonary tuberculosis occurred after admission, whereas during the previous 5 years, there were 14 such cases. The details are a bit scant. In those previous 5 years, did the boys have pasteurized milk? Did they have less milk? Did they have milk at all? He doesn't actually say. What were their backgrounds? He says they entered the homes for various reasons. In other words, they're all different, not good for comparison. He mentioned some had parents who died of TB. Did he tell us how often that was the case compared to the previous 5 years? No. What other dietary, environmental, or lifestyle differences were there? He doesn't say. He just says that they believe the extra nutrition made a difference. If there were a published study, it might have some of this information, but there wasn't. Dr. McDonald does make a reference to a published paper. In the paper, dentist Evelyn Sprawson documents several groups of children at different locations who were given raw milk daily, and he shows that they got very few cavities. The younger they were given milk, the better. That makes sense. Specifically, though, he argues that raw milk prevents cavities and that pasteurized milk does not. His comparison group is 23 children who were given 12 ounces of pasteurized milk daily during the school year. He compares 44 boys, about roughly the same age-ish, who were given 20 ounces of raw milk every day. The pasteurized group got way more cavities, but they also got way less milk. Not much of a fair comparison, is it? Also, a fifth of the cavities in the pasteurized group were in one kid. That's small sample sizes for you. Indeed, he doesn't show whether the groups are comparable in predisposing factors. He does mention diet. Some kids were getting refined carbohydrates, but only in some of the raw milk groups. We don't know the diet in the other groups. And he doesn't say if there are any differences in dental hygiene. Isn't that important? It is interesting to note, not making an argument here, just saying, that to find out what this citation was referring to, I had to find the first page of this paywalled news summary, dig up the full text of the Poole Corporation bill, figure out what Dr. Bernardo's home was, hunt for what I could about this Dr. McDonald, track down the correspondence, and then locate the Sprawson paper. All for things that were written 90 years ago, when most people didn't even have electric refrigerators. Listen, the idea that children can be healthy drinking raw milk is not controversial, as long as they don't get typhoid, bovine tuberculosis, listeria, salmonella, campylobacter, E. coli, a new mutant strain of avian flu, etc. Then they're not so healthy. Anyway, what were the rest of Lord Cranworth's arguments? Allow me to paraphrase. I'm no expert, but, well, actually that's kind of a good thing because you can't trust experts. This legislation will put mom-and-pop milk farmers out of business. There are thousands of people who think this is a bad idea. What do you expect poor people to do to get vitamin C? Buy orange juice? Pasteurization devitalizes milk. It's not real milk anymore. A large percentage of doctors drink raw milk, probably. It would be interesting to know if that's true. I bet it is. If milk is pasteurized, sure, it kills the germs. But then the milk doesn't go sour after 12 hours. So then people keep their dirty milk in the icebox for 3 to 4 days. Ew. There is more pasteurized milk in the city than in the country. And more people die from tuberculosis in cities than in the country. Coincidence? More people who didn't drink milk at all have died from tuberculosis than people who drank raw milk. Farmers already have to spend loads of money to make sure everything's clean. That's all pointless if we're just going to pasteurize it. People can get sick from germs that come from other things, not just raw milk. Even if we require pasteurization, people might do it wrong. I heard of this experiment where, I think it was rats. They were given pasteurized milk and they all died at some point. This is something that should be handled by His Majesty's government, not localities. This is panic legislation and will set a grave precedent. How did the other lords respond to this gish gallop? The noble Lord Cranworth is, albeit unintentionally, confusing clean and infected milk. Milk may be perfectly clean and yet be infected. On the other hand, it may be uninfected and yet not be clean. If it is carried out effectively, there is an overwhelming body of evidence, not confined to this country, but shared by every civilized country in the world, that pasteurization is an efficient means of preventing the conveyance of certain infectious diseases. Is it to be said we are panicky when 51 people died in our midst and our children were taken away to hospital? Yet when we ask for this relief, it is said we come here in a panic and ask for something that is unusual. The health of the community must come first, and private interests and private profits afterwards. I think it's pretty obvious what the outcome was. The clause was deleted. Listen, lords. The whole rest of this bill is unopposed. And this extra little clause makes it opposed. It would have to go back to committee, it would take a lot of time, not to mention money, to push it through. Let's just get the original bill passed. Besides, a national pasteurization requirement will be made any day now. It's right around the corner.
It wasn't.
1933. According to the pamphlet, raw milk is better than pasteurized milk in promoting growth and calcium absorption. So here we find proof in the Ohio Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin 518, which states, "It is obvious that in these experiments, the rats utilized the minerals of pasteurized milk just as well as those of raw milk. No difference was found in the calcium and phosphorus content of the entire bodies of rats fed either raw or pasteurized milk exclusively. The calcium and phosphorus in pasteurized milk are as readily available as in raw milk." I don't think it says what they think it says. This source contradicts their claim. Before we go back to 1917, let's go to 1865. In 1865, the perfect infant food was invented. It was called Liebig's formula, made of cow's milk, wheat flour, malt flour, and potassium bicarbonate. This was the first baby formula, and it could be powdered and preserved without bacterial contamination. This was a lifesaver for babies who couldn't be breastfed, and it reduced the risk of infections. It was one of many innovations in the 1800s, and infant mortality really started to drop. But perfect food? That's a bit pretentious. While sea scurvy had decreased in the mid-1800s, land scurvy became a thing, a problem among infants, especially among the affluent, those who were getting formula. As you might guess, Liebig's formula and others didn't have enough vitamin C. It took some time for scurvy in infants to be recognized as scurvy. Once they figured it out in the 1880s, then the prevention and cure was known. Supplement the formula with orange juice. Orange juice worked. They didn't know why, but it solved the problem. Meanwhile, people were looking to study scurvy in animals so we could learn more about it without harming humans. But most animals can't get scurvy. Was there an animal that could be used as a guinea pig to study scurvy? By 1907, Norwegian researchers Holst and Furlick demonstrated in guinea pigs that scurvy was induced by a dietary deficiency, a lack of an anti-scorbutic factor. They didn't know what the factor was or which foods it was in, but they knew there was one. They also found that heating and drying could destroy it. That anti-scorbutic factor, vitamin C, wasn't isolated and identified until the 1930s. But let's get back to the 1917 reference. The events that led to it started in 1912 in the Hebrew Infant Asylum, 5 years after Holst and Froelich published. The Hebrew Infant Asylum. Just kidding. It was an orphanage, not a place for murderous infants. It was in the Bronx, New York. The medical director was pediatrician Dr. Alfred F. Hess. He has been described as one of the greatest clinical nutritional researchers of the early 20th century. Dr. Edwards Park said Hess was the foremost investigator among pediatricians in this country. There was no one else who could possibly be compared with him. Guess he's legit. Hess saw himself in a great position to do research. My opportunity for a clinical study has been exceptional, as the children were in a model institution where the diet was prepared in a central kitchen, and all the conditions were uniform and capable of control. Furthermore, I was sure the infants received a diet adequate in calories and other food factors. It is only under similar conditions that studies on chronic nutritional disorders can be carried out. Chronic nutritional disorders meaning rickets and scurvy. The standard diet for the infants was pasteurized cow's milk supplemented with orange juice. But was the orange juice really needed? It wasn't exactly ideal. It was expensive and difficult to get, especially in the New York City winter, and it had to be prepared and given separately from other food, so it was liable to be forgotten. In 1912, due to an oversight at the orphanage, orange juice was not given. Scurvy broke out. So, they wondered, were there any other things besides orange juice that would prevent scurvy? They knew that orange juice would reverse the symptoms in just a couple days, so that was a fallback if other things weren't working. Hess ultimately published 5 papers about their experiments. As long as the true nature of the antiscorbutic vitamin is unknown, we shall gain valuable knowledge of the essential chemical substance which forms the basis of this disorder by ascertaining substances that do or do not possess antiscorbutic power. They tried a bunch of different things. Pasteurized milk, potato flour, mashed potatoes, refined cereal, white grain cereal, yeast, wheat embryo, orange peel made into a juice and sweetened, powdered milk, evaporated milk, and, of course, raw milk. According to Hess, there were other patients in the same ward on the identical diet who did not develop scurvy. In other words, the pasteurized milk was not the sole factor in the production of the disease. That the pasteurization did play an important role, however, was shown by substituting raw, unheated milk for the pasteurized milk, the formula and the amount of food remaining unchanged. In this case, the scorbutic symptoms began to disappear within a week of giving raw milk and had altogether vanished in 2 weeks. Raw cow's milk must not, on the other hand, be considered as having potent antiscorbutic properties. Its effect cannot be compared to the miraculous change which is brought about by giving orange juice. This is especially striking when we take into consideration the small amount of orange juice necessary to bring about a cure, and compare it with the large amount of raw milk which is given. They documented the effects of scurvy extensively, with the hopes that this information would allow people to diagnose it earlier and more accurately. The earliest signs were at 4 to 7 weeks, but couldn't clearly be distinguished from other conditions until 4.5 months. It took 6 to 9 months for full-blown infantile scurvy to develop. They observed the characteristic small hemorrhages under the skin. They took venous blood samples and found that bleeding was due to the blood vessels becoming weak and leaky and not due to longer clotting times. X-rays of 3 infants showed the heart could become enlarged. They kept charts of infant weights. Infants with scurvy stopped growing, but resumed when given orange juice. They also observed that scurvy made infants more susceptible to disease, like flu, diphtheria, and pneumonia. Orange juice could cure the scurvy, but not infections. So when the pamphlet says raw milk is very effective in preventing scurvy and protecting against flu, diphtheria, and pneumonia, this is where it came from. Well, that's not exactly honest. It's not raw milk that protects against those things. It's vitamin C. And it's not that vitamin C is protective per se. You can't just load up on it and get more protection. It's just that an extreme lack of it makes you vulnerable. But back to the orphanage. They had used commercially pasteurized milk, which wasn't given until 24 to 48 hours after pasteurization. So they tried fresh raw milk that they then pasteurized in their kitchen and gave the same day. They also compared this to raw milk that had been kept on ice for 48 hours. The milk that had been pasteurized and given the same day did better than the raw milk. The freshness mattered. Aging seemed to play a greater role in the production of scurvy than heating, whether the milk was pasteurized or raised to the boiling point. It was found that even raw milk on aging loses its antiscorbutic properties. It is interesting to note, not making an argument here, just saying, that Hess did not recommend raw milk to avoid scurvy. He recommended pasteurized milk because it was safer, but emphasized that an anti-scorbutic was needed. Although pasteurized milk is to be recommended on account of the security which it affords against infection, we should realize that it is an incomplete food. Unless an anti-scorbutic, such as orange juice, the juice of orange peel, or potato water is added, infants will develop scurvy on this diet. In the end, they did find some alternatives to orange juice. They were particularly impressed with the peel. It was more economical and just as effective. And they did improve the ability to diagnose infantile scurvy. They also improved recommendations. For infants fed on pasteurized milk, Hess pushed for anti-scorbutics to be given much earlier than previously recommended. However, one might question the ethics of these studies. In fact, one did question. In 1921, a journalist named Konrad Berkovici wrote a scathing critique that was published in the magazine The Nation. Orphans as guinea pigs. It is of course understood that studies on the effects of different diets on children should be made, but where the experiments lead to such diseases as scurvy and rickets, and the subjects are institutional infants and not volunteers, the end in view does not justify the method. Needless to say, the physicians who carried on didactic experiments on the infants of the Hebrew Orphan Asylum are persons of the highest professional standing, men devoted to their profession and to the serving of humanity. That their experiments have great value admits of no dispute, but no devotion to science, no thought for the greater good to the greater number, can for an instant justify the experimenting on helpless infants. Voluntary consent by adults should, of course, be the sine qua non of scientific experimentation. By the way, when I went looking for this 1917 reference, this article was the first thing I found. It was not a good look. Berkovici concluded, the medical profession should officially take steps to prohibit such procedure in the future. It is difficult enough to contend with the anti-vivisection fanatics and the various freaks and cranks who are constitutionally hostile to organized medicine and its progress. But a condition such as that related above cannot but react unfavorably in all these respects upon the profession as a whole and upon the benefits which it can confer on mankind. I think it's pretty obvious what the outcome was. Nothing. It didn't get much attention or interest. This was no brown dog affair. It really wasn't until after World War II that ethics for biomedical research were codified. It was a different time. Real milk harkens back to a bygone era when the pastures were greener, the cows were realer, the butter was luscious and naturally yellow, and the orphans were guinea pigs. Maybe we should be careful about romanticizing the past. I know people who drink full-fat, non-homogenized raw milk because, in their words, it's delicious. I don't object to adults choosing to drink raw milk, but it needs to be an informed choice, right? How does this pamphlet do with its informing? Let's see. We have a statement about heart disease where their own article says it's debunked, a citation that's the wrong volume and that's about a sterol that comes from plants, a citation about calcium absorption that says the opposite of what they say it says, the words studies show followed by citing a news article, a reference to research that involved observing hemorrhages in infants that were knowingly malnourished. Is there any reason to trust anything this pamphlet says? They say modern stainless steel tanks, milking machines, and refrigerated trucks and improved testing methods make pasteurization absolutely unnecessary for public protection. This is false. Just last year, there was a salmonella outbreak tied to raw milk that made 171 people sick and sent 22 to the hospital. The risk is real. Now, before anyone says anything, yes, there are also outbreaks from pasteurized products. They can get contaminated after pasteurization. It's true. I don't deny it. But it is interesting to note, and I absolutely am making an argument. There are more outbreaks from unpasteurized products than pasteurized, even though just a small percentage of people consume unpasteurized. Less than 2% in the US drink raw milk regularly, according to the Food Safety Survey. The risk from unpasteurized is much, much higher. I don't think I need to harp on this point. Everyone who drinks raw milk has been warned about the risks, and they're tired of hearing it. If an adult looks at that risk and decides it's an acceptable risk for them, that's their choice. But to deny the risk, as the Weston A. Price Foundation does, to say pasteurization is absolutely unnecessary is to deny the truth. And that bugs me. Don't let them tell you a fairy tale about the past, and don't let them tell you a fairy tale about the present. That's all I have for today. I would love to hear what you think. What's your reaction to the sources? Have you ever had raw milk, and do you like it? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you next time. Eat your vegetables.